taking Chris's point a step further about journalism being about explaining and putting balance in stories. We both worked for Reuters for many years. And balancing stories is very important. It's like Chris says, people have a very negative view of China. It's very easy to find people that will give you a negative view of China. But explaining the other side of the story is something that gets left out of an awful lot of journalism. And when I teach journalism these days, one of my first sessions that I do is to talk about context and education and explanation. And it's a very, very vital and large part of any journalism and any story that you explain, you educate, and you put context around things. I see an awful lot of stories, not just in Taiwan, right across the world, where context, real important context is missing. And I'm not just talking about highest, tallest, longest type of context, but the kind of context that explains, for example, if you're writing a story out of Pakistan, explaining what the difference between Sunni and Shia Muslims is. Now that's almost totally lacking with a lot of stories I read where there's ethnic clashes between the two. And it just simply, the story just simply doesn't explain what the difference is. You can do it in 3 lines, but that gets forgotten and left out. And that's really your point of explaining the other side of things and putting the context of why this happens. I think that's very, very important. It is one of the first sessions I do when I'm teaching journalism. Also asking decent questions. Thinking about the questions you're going to ask before you pick up the phone. There's so many, particularly young journalists, just do not think through the kind of answers they're going to get. And someone like Chris will sit down and really work out the questions he's going to ask before he picks up the phone or goes and sees someone. It's a vital part. And that, to me, when I watch a lot of stories or TV stories or radio stories, the journalists that did them clearly didn't go through that process and prepare enough. I think there was a map to start with. Can you start on the first? Yes. So a little bit of geography lesson for those of you who are not tremendously au fait with the region. This was basically my region: India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka. Let's start with Afghanistan. I was there, obviously, before the Americans pulled out. It's a very, very different country now. But the one thing, I went up there in 2014 to help cover the elections, or election, I should say. And we went to a local polling station. And the authorities at the time in Afghanistan were so keen to be shown to be fair that when we brought the cameras into the polling station, which was in a school, and we set the camera up, and they asked us to put it closer to the stage where they were opening the votes. So we put the camera quite close to the stage. And the officials, when they opened the votes, they read the result, and they held the vote up to the camera. Every single one. We stood there for maybe an hour while they counted like 600 or 700 votes. They were so keen, particularly when they knew we were international press, to say, we are doing this properly. You know, we're not cheating. Now, whether these votes were genuine is another story, but they were very, very keen. And at the time, I was very hopeful and very bullish about Afghanistan. Of course, it's completely different now since the Americans left, so all bets are off. But they were genuine as an, you know, as an embryo government that was trying to make a very messy, very screwed up country work. They were very focused on making sure that information got out in the right way. And a true way. And I was very impressed by that. It's just a shame that it's actually all disappeared now and gone. Pakistan, in terms of press freedom, not good. In fact, it's one of the countries where I worried a lot about my journalists there being beaten up or being hassled by the police and politicians. I think probably more by the political side of things than anything else. And we had safe rooms in all their flats, for example, in case a gunman got into the compound or something like that. So there was an awful lot of safety issues. When I was walking around, particularly Karachi, there was always a kidnap threat, for example, because people would know there was a senior journalist in the country and you become a kidnap target. So an awful lot of time, and it's the same in Myanmar, it's the same in those kind of countries. You do get, you know, political politically motivated people will come after journalists because they've written something they don't agree with. And you've got the other safety threat as well from pure kidnapping, especially if you work for a large firm. Imran Khan, the former leader, there's an awful lot of charges against him of threatening journalists directly and overtly. That's one of the things that they're bringing him to book now. He's on trial for it now, or one of the things he's on trial for. Pakistan, extremely difficult place to work for a journalist. They do have, and they did have 10, 15 years ago, quite a free press. Dawn, which is the biggest media group in Pakistan, is actually quite aggressively, tries to be quite aggressively independent. But the journalists that work for these companies self-censor themselves. And it's one of the biggest issues. And as Chris will tell you about China, we had a newsroom full of people that would self-censor all the time just because they were frightened. They didn't want to stick their neck out. And that's for people like Chris and I working there as foreigners, we had to try and get beyond that and through that and help them through that because it is very, very difficult. It's the same in some of the Southeast Asian countries. Thailand as well. They can self-censor quite badly. So you get a skewed file or skewed stories out of these countries just because the journalists are too frightened to operate openly. Bangladesh, poor old Bangladesh, it's just a messy country. Again, a lot of interference with the press there. It's supposed to be a free press. It's actually written into their little old constitution there, but it really doesn't mean much. It's nothing like the First Amendment in the States. It just doesn't really operate. And it's deeply corrupt. So all the companies there are on a take, and they can get very aggressive with the journalists as well. If you're an economics correspondent and you write a story about a company and they don't like it, they'll come after you, really quite overtly. Let's talk about Sri Lanka at the bottom. Sri Lanka's, again, especially under Rajapaksa, Sri Lanka got very, very aggressive with the journalists. I had a photographer down there that took a picture of two people talking to each other that shouldn't have been talking to each other. We had to pull him and his family out of Sri Lanka and put them in Delhi for 3 years till the dust settled. And I've had to do that out of China as well, Shanghai. We relocated someone to Hong Kong because the Bureau of State Security was after her. So it does happen elsewhere. Sri Lanka is quite a dangerous place for journalists to operate in. They will come after you. And we had a bureau chief down there, and the government started following his wife around. She would go out shopping with their kids, and there'd be a car behind them all the time. And it's really just a sort of we're watching you type of threat. And she got incredibly worried, and it's very upsetting. They will do that. You know, they have done that, and it's quite nasty, Sri Lanka. India's a little bit more free going. I don't know if you know, but India has the world's largest English language newspaper, Times of India, with the biggest circulation. In India, yes, there's an awful lot of political pressure, and politicians will call up journalists and threaten them. And most of them, again, we get back to this self-censorship issue. So, you know, the newspapers can say, we're not censored. Nope, anyone could write what they like. The trouble is all the people in the newsroom don't write what they want to write because they're frightened of doing it. India as well, there's a lot of corporate pressure. So our business reporters were getting an awful lot of pressure from businesses who would first ring them up and try and bribe them. And when that didn't work, they would threaten them. And I had a lot of my newsroom come to me on a fairly regular basis saying, I keep getting calls and messages from this guy who first of all was basically offering me money. And I said, no, thanks. Now he's getting very aggressive. And I had numerous calls. It happened a couple of times in China with big companies. But I had numerous calls in India directly with the CEOs of quite big companies telling them to back off. It never got to a stage where I called the police in or anything like that. But that's, again, people will self-censor. So you're trying to run a newsroom, particularly if you've got a large newsroom, it's difficult for you to do your job because your staff are self-censoring themselves. And it's very hard to counter that because people say, hey, I've got a wife and kids and a family and I need an income, I can't afford to get sacked, you know, and they will go to sort of quite strong lengths or far-reaching lengths to get back at journalists they don't like. But broadly speaking, of the whole bunch of those countries, India is the best and easiest to work with. People will talk. Indians love to talk. You can ring up anyone in India and they'll talk for hours. In fact, you can't shut them up, especially the academics, sorry. So that's really South Asia. I enjoyed it. I was there for 6 years, so I got to know it reasonably well. I would say the regime in India now under Modi is a lot tougher. I think India has mirrored, well, not mirrored, it's exactly the same as China under Xi. The old regime was easier, and I struggle to use the word liberal, but it was less conservative, if you like. Under Modi, India is changing as a country in a very significant way. And as Chris was talking about, you know, what makes headlines? India doesn't make a lot of headlines. You know, it's not a story until it's a story. China makes headlines all the time, but India doesn't. So it's kind of this whole Modi dynamic that's happening, and the Hindu nationalism that's happening in India worries me personally. But it's happening kind of in secret, behind this curtain of sort of non-publicity, if you like. You know, the counter to that is somewhere like Taiwan, that is now a global news story. Since Ukraine, and all the wise old heads supposedly in Europe said, oh, well, Taiwan's going to be next. Which is totally untrue, right? It's the opposite, in fact. But Taiwan now is a headline story around the world. Journalists in London will say, oh, this is about Taiwan. They'll write a story about it. 3 years ago, that wouldn't have happened to that degree. So I think that dynamic has really changed in Taiwan. And the local media is the window into Taiwan now. And if I dare say it, I think at the moment, in general, they're falling down on the job. They should be doing a better job of telling the Taiwan story to the rest of the world. Not for domestic use, but trying to get the message of Taiwan out to the world, I think, is vitally important, particularly at this moment, with the whole China dynamic and the Russia-Ukraine dynamic happening globally.